So we've got A about 50, B about 100, C about 600, or D about 1,000. I'd also like, while we're doing this chat, to say good morning to our friends joining us from YouTube. So we do have our live stream going as well. So good morning to you all as well. Feel free to answer in the chat on YouTube. Good morning, Mill Pond. I see you all. Hello. Hello, Amber. I see you as well. Joseph Whelan, Nicole Father Jean, Kotaro. Good morning to everyone. I do see a couple of answers in our chat, a D, B, and a C. We're getting all sorts of answers. Does anybody else want to try answering this one in the chat? How many species do we think are at risk? Could be difficult to come to a consensus as a class here. This is such a mixture. Oh my goodness. This is a hard question. I couldn't find very fun questions today, so they're all just kind of, I don't know. I hope you guys don't mind them. So this one is actually C. So it's just over 600 species that are actually at risk of extinction in Canada. So just over 600. And I did put a picture on here of the black-footed ferret. You might have heard of it before. So this is one of them that we're really keeping a close eye on. All right, let's try number 2. Okay, so we know that 600 are at risk. How many are already extinct? Do we have any extinct species in Canada? Is it none? Do we think it's about 10, about 20, or is it over 20? So what do we think? A, B, C, or D? None would be awesome. I don't know if it's true, but it would be great. B's, C's, we're thinking about 10 or 20. I got another C, about 20. Another B. What do we think, guys? So this one, the picture that I put on here is a picture of a woods bison. So just to give you a hint, that is a species that is extinct. So that's at least one. So the correct answer for this one is actually D. Over 20 species are already extinct in Canada. So this one was D. So we've already got over 20 and then another 600 on the way. So a lot of species we got to look out for that we're going to learn about a few today. Okay, last one before we get started. What is the biggest threat to the survival of Canadian plants and animals? So what is causing these extinctions? Is it A, habitat loss, B, traffic accidents, C, hunting, or D, plastic pollution? What do we think the biggest issue is? C and D and A. Oh, I see we've got a couple more people just popping in from our waiting room. Good morning. Welcome to those of us that are just joining. Our last trivia question here. Oh, Mill Pond, you guys think it's A? Mill Pond is the one who got it right for this one, guys. The biggest issue is habitat loss. So good job, Mill Pond. So I've got a picture here with a grizzly bear and her cubs, and you can see that we've got a loss of habitat. So that's things like deforestation, cutting down trees, removing prairies to make farmland, filling in wetlands. So all of that stuff counts as habitat loss. Okay, I know we probably will still have a couple of schools joining us late, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a very full presentation today, so I want to make sure we have lots of room for questions. So welcome, good morning. We are running our climate and wildlife event with the Canadian Wildlife Federation this morning. So if that's where you're supposed to be, you are in the right place. Now, before we get started, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I am joining from Amiskwaciwa-Skyakem. So this is colonially known as Edmonton, and it's on Treaty 6 territory. This land is a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to many groups, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and the Nakota Sioux. I would also like to acknowledge all of the traditional territories and lands that we are joining from today. Since we're meeting virtually, it's a great opportunity for you to connect to the lands that you each call home. Having respect for the land that we share with other living things is an important step in the reconciliation process with Indigenous groups around the world. And we have the privilege today to be able to look deeper into our connection with the plants and animals we share our lands with. So I invite you all during the event to keep this in the front of your minds and really think about your connection to all of the living things where you are joining from, whether it's here on Turtle Island with me or anywhere across the globe. Now, just a quick look at our agenda. It's very full today, so we will hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for some questions. But Kaylee has made our event very interactive. So if you have any questions or comments throughout the event, there's a couple of great ways you can get involved. Number one, type in the chat, just like we did in our practice. So you guys all did a great job answering my trivia questions in the chat. Great way to get questions across too. So we'll make sure if you get some questions in there, we'll get them answered. Now, we also love to hear and see you. So if you would like to ask a question on your microphone, you can also do that. You just have to choose the little reaction button and raise your hand so that I know you have a question. Then I can call on you to unmute and you can ask your question. So those are two great ways that we can get questions across or comments during the event. I would like to take a second to welcome all of the schools that registered for this event. Now, I know we had to move our event a week, so I don't think all of us are quite able to make it today, but to those of us joining us live on Zoom, and if you see your name here on the list, you might be joining from YouTube. So welcome and good morning. Thank you for taking the time today to learn about climate and wildlife. We know it's a very important issue, but hopefully we can learn a little bit together today about this. All right, so that's it for me. I'm now going to welcome our special guest speaker to go ahead and start her presentation. So Kaylee Setter is from Calgary, Alberta, and is the experiential education manager at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. As part of the education team, she works to connect people with nature through hands-on learning activities and conservation projects. From the mountains to the grasslands, she's collaborated with conservation researchers and scientists across the country to educate people of all ages about Canada's wildlife habitats and real-world conservation work on the ground. So welcome, Kaylee.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I know we've got people joining from all across the country, so I'm so excited to be here with you. Give me a second. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Give me that thumbs up if you can see my slide deck so I know. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, my name's Kaylee and I work with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And ever since I was in school, I've really just been so interested in wildlife. And as I grew up and kind of decided what I was going to study in school, my focus was on the environment and in education. And education is such a huge part because if we don't know about these things, how can we take action to help wildlife? So thank you for being here today with me to talk about climate and wildlife. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you know what climate change is? Have you heard about climate change? Do we know a bit about climate change? Great. Yeah, it's a really good time to be talking about it because actually today is the start of the UN Climate and Biodiversity Conference here in Canada in Montreal. But I wanted to jump in before we talk about wildlife and just talk a bit about what is climate change. So for some of you that you might already know this, and that's okay. This is just a good reminder. But for those of you who aren't really sure, let's just talk a bit about what climate change is all about. So when we talk about climate, it's a little bit different than weather. You look outside your window and you see what's happening outside. So in Calgary today, it's kind of chilly and snowy out there. That's weather. But when we talk about climate, it's long-term. So when we talk about climate change, it's these long-term shifts in temperature and weather. And they can be impacted by a lot of natural things, like a volcano erupting can change the weather and can change the climate over a long period of time. And sometimes changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun, that can in fact affect our climate as well. But it's really important to note that since like the 1800s, it's human activities that have been a big driver of climate change. So we've been producing a lot of greenhouse gases from driving cars, different sources. And those things go into our atmosphere and they act like a blanket around the Earth. So they trap that sun's heat in and it increases the overall temperature. So you can see that picture there. The sun comes in and the energy bounces around in the atmosphere and gets trapped. And that's really important because without the atmosphere, it'd be very cold and we wouldn't be able to survive on Earth. But because of some of the pollution and greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere, overall, the temperature is slowly getting warmer and warmer. on average over long term. So the climate is starting to change and it's having some impacts on the planet. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and especially how it impacts wildlife. So this is a very famous picture. When they first went to space and they went to the moon, they took a picture looking back at Earth. So this is from the moon looking back at Earth, and it's called Earthrise. And it was really important because when they went out and looked back at Earth, I think we realized how small a planet we are. We're a little blue marble floating in this massive dark space. And so it really made people think about how we're just, a small planet in a big universe. And so when we think about climate, we have to remember that the Earth's a system, so everything's interconnected. It's like a sweater. If you pull one string, it's going to affect and maybe unravel parts of the sweater. So everything on Earth is a system and it's related. So everything's interconnected. I'm sure some of you have learned about food webs and food chains and how, some things eat other things and then decompose and then create plants. So everything's connected. And as a result, the impacts of climate change are complicated. It might affect the animals and plants in different ways. And if it affects one animal, that might be a problem, because what about the animal that relies on it for food and eats it? Then it's impacted. So we have to remember that the impacts are complex and we don't know even yet what the full impacts are. Researchers and scientists are still looking into that. So it's very complicated. But some of the impacts that we have seen is rising temperatures. So overall, the global temperature of the planet has increased by around 1.1 degrees Celsius since like 1880, they say. So it's creeping up on average. So rising temperatures. And when the temperature goes up, that means that sometimes our snow and glaciers are melting. So it's changing those. When the water melts, it flows to the ocean. So the sea levels might be rising in some places. People have seen changing weather patterns. So maybe storms, like powerful storms coming through, or some places it might be drought, which leads to like a scarcity of water, or heat waves. I know some of us, like last summer, it got really hot in some parts of Canada and people were really, really hot and couldn't go out and do things because of the temperature. So it might lead to some fires or flooding. And of course, it can impact wildlife and change biodiversity. And when we talked about those quiz questions at the beginning, it can impact wildlife. So there's a lot of things that can be impacted by climate, and it's worth keeping those in mind. But really what we want to talk about today is how might climate change affect different types of wildlife? So let's take a look. We're going to be investigators here today, and I'm relying on all of you to help me. So first question for everyone, and maybe we can get people to answer in the chat, or if there's any classrooms that want to unmute and share. What do you think animals need to survive in their habitats? What are the key things they need to survive where they're living? Anyone have ideas? And maybe Rebecca, you can help me in picking some of the classrooms.
Mill Pond is raising their hand. So Mill Pond, if you wanted to unmute, feel free to share a couple of your ideas.
Yeah, what are your ideas?
Like good temperature, because if climate change happens, then it's going to be too hot to live in that habitat and they'll be forced to move to a cooler place.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we all kind of have, all species have an ideal temperature they like. And if it gets too hot, then they have to move. Or if it's too cold, it's hard on them. So that's a great idea. Yeah, they do. Temperature does matter. Anything else about the places they live? The things that we need to, and animals need to stay alive. Any thoughts? I see maybe we've got
shelter, water, food.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I see Kai says shelter, Nicole and Mark, shelter, water, air, and food. Yeah, Kai said food. Absolutely. Check marks. We need food. Animals need food. So there's a picture of a bird eating some berries. Water is really important. They need sources of water. There's a picture there of butterflies in a mud puddle because they also need water. Shelter, so homes where we're protected from the temperature and elements, like Mill Pond was saying. So there's some fish that are sheltering in some vegetation under the water. And space, and some animals don't need a lot of space and some animals need a lot of space. So these are the 4 things that we generally like to keep in mind when we talk about wildlife, is that they need food and they need water, they need shelter, and they need space. So those are the big things I want you all to keep in mind. And so there are an estimated 80,000 species in Canada, but that's not including bacteria and viruses and like those little microscopic things we can't see. So not thinking about bacteria and viruses, there's still around 80,000 different species in Canada. So there's tons of wildlife. There's mammals and amphibians and birds. You can see just a few of them pictured here. So what I thought we could do is maybe meet just a few and learn a bit about them and think about how climate change might be impacting them and their habitats. So the first one is a Canada jay. Has anybody seen a Canada jay before? They're also called whiskey jacks, but hands up if you have, maybe not. Oh yeah, Rebecca has, great. So they're pretty cute, cool little birds. They eat seeds, they eat insects and berries. So that they're omnivore. I don't know if everyone knows that word, but they eat both meat and, like I said, vegetation. And what they do is they'll hide stashes of food in trees to get through the winter. So they'll collect little bits and using their sticky saliva, they'll put it under bark or stick it in trees and save it for later, kind of like putting stuff in a freezer over the winter. Say, okay, I'll store up a bunch of stuff and throughout the winter, then they'll go back and they'll eat their little stores. And that's what keeps them going through the winter. So they store up a bunch of things in trees and because it's cold outside, it'll stay cold over the winter, kind of like putting things in your freezer. For water, they will drink water and they can even eat snow if needed. It's really hard for animals to eat snow because it takes up a lot of their energy to warm it up. So a lot of winter animals are good at conserving their water, but they'll drink water and birds do drink water. And then their shelter, they nest in trees. So trees are really important to them because that's where they spend a lot of time. And space, they live in spruce and fir forests, but they don't migrate south. Like some birds say, oh, it's too cold for me. I'm going to leave. I'm going to head south. But this bird sticks around. So it doesn't migrate south for the winter. Instead, it decides to store up all that food and then it'll eat it throughout the winter. So these are some fun facts about the Canada jay. But knowing these things, I want to ask you all, how might climate change affect its food? Any ideas? You talked about how it eats seeds and insects and berries and how important it is to hide that food in trees over the winter time and keep it cold. What do you think might happen if, say, the temperatures were warming up and climate was changing? Anybody have any ideas around what could happen to their food? Let's see if anyone's got an idea.
Bit of a trickier one. Milpon, go ahead.
Yeah. So if it gets warmer, there might not be as much snow, and snow provides a lot of water for trees and plants. And without that water, they might die and then they don't have seeds to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. So when climate changes, there might be fewer seeds available because there's not as much growing because it's changed the amount of rain or water falling. So first of all, it might be harder for the birds to even find seeds or berries just because they're not growing. I see Nicole in the chat said if it's too hot, it could set their tree on fire and burn the berries. That's a really good point too. If it's really dry and trees aren't getting moisture, then there might be a higher chance of forest fires. So maybe that area might be in danger of burning if there happens to be a forest fire. Really good answers. And you can tell it's a bit of a investigation, right? It's not always really clear how it might impact these species. But one thing that I was reading in the news recently, and these are some pictures from some newspapers, is that climate change means that some of that food they've stored in trees is becoming freezer burn. So it's warming up in the winter. And so all of the food in their freezer is going bad. So they store it in the trees, hoping it'll last them throughout the winter. But because temperatures are increasing, it's going bad before the end of winter. So they don't have as much food. It's like if somebody turned the power off in your house and the freezer wasn't cold anymore, all that food would get spoiled. So these are some articles from researchers who are studying Canada jays, and they've found that sometimes the numbers of these birds are decreasing because they just don't have the food, or they can't keep the food cold over the winter. So they have to rely on smaller caches of food. So something really interesting, and obviously really important for them, because if they don't have food, then it's really hard for them to survive the winter. So good investigative work. That's great. So here's another one. This is a northern leopard frog. It's also native to Canada. So it eats insects and spiders and worms. And it is really reliant on water, because amphibians absorb water and oxygen through their skin. So they live in water, and that's kind of helps them breathe in oxygen. It's through their skin often. And for shelter, they lay their eggs among the vegetation in ponds, and they'll actually hibernate in ponds in the mud in areas that don't freeze over. So they'll be there all winter as long as it doesn't get too cold. And then they kind of live in and around shallow wetlands because it's safer from fish. If the water's not as deep, there's not as many fish in the pond, and fish will eat frogs. So they like some of these wetlands that are shallower because there's not as many predators in there to eat them. So thinking about how important water is to amphibians and frogs like the northern leopard frog, how do you think climate change might affect the availability of water? What might happen if the temperature changed or rainfall changed? What might happen, do you think, that would impact the frogs? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas? It's a tricky one. Let's see some comments in the chat. Water heats up and evaporates. Absolutely. Yeah. So when it gets hot, the water will evaporate and go up into kind of the sky, and there might be less water available. So he says flooding. Yeah, maybe there's more. Maybe there's rain and there's too much rain because there's a big storm coming through because there's so much energy in the atmosphere, and maybe it's going to flood or cause problems that way. Too much water could be a problem too. Any other thoughts on that one? These are great observations and great critical thinking. Okay, so yeah, some more articles. So amphibians like the northern leopard frog rely on these wetlands that are really shallow, and you can see in the upper right hand corner this picture of just wetlands all over the place, and that's great frog habitat because they can travel between all of these wetlands. But what happens is they're temporary wetlands that often dry up in the summer, and that's called an ephemeral wetland. So that's a big word, but it just means temporary wetlands. So they're really important in the spring. And I don't know if anyone's gone out in the spring and heard all the frogs calling, or have been out and they're croaking and calling. They're really active in the spring because that's when they're laying all their eggs, and they need these temporary ponds. But you all hit the nail right on the head when you said, there might be too much water and it could flood and clear out all those areas, which is bad because they're really sensitive at that time. Or alternatively, if it's really dry, could be a problem because these wetlands might all dry up, and then where are the frogs going to go? So you can start to see how climate change can start to impact water as well. And there's even some really interesting studies that say frogs age faster when it gets warmer. Their life cycle speeds up. So they're more active because they're cold-blooded, so they're influenced by temperature, and their metabolism goes faster, and they'll age faster when it's hotter out too. So really interesting studies that researchers are looking at to see how climate change might impact water, how it might impact amphibians. How about polar bears? Anybody like polar bears or seen? I don't know if anyone's seen a polar bear. I certainly have never seen a polar bear. They live a bit farther north than me, but they're pretty iconic, right? They're massive. They're huge bears. And what do they eat? They eat seals that live at the edge of the ice. And what they do is they feed in the winter. They eat, so they can conserve their energy in the summer. So they're not as active in the summer. They're out there in the winter because they're built for winter. They've got thick fur and lots of adaptations to help them survive. And so they're out in the winter eating up so they can save up. And then in the summer, they're not doing quite as much. But they mainly eat like a lot of seals. And then water, it gets it actually from the food it eats. It's really good at conserving water, because if it ate snow or ate ice and things, that would take a lot of energy, because that cools your body down. So instead, they're really good at conserving water, and it eats a lot of fat. It doesn't eat the meat and protein. It'll eat all the fat, and you get a lot of water from its diet. So it's really clever in conserving water in cold times. And so for shelter, it'll build dens in the snow and out on the ice, and then it can have cubs protected in the snow. So snow is really important too. And then finally, space. It lives way up in the north on the Arctic sea ice cap. So that's all of the ice that's up north. There's no land under it. It's just really thick ice, and it lives out on the ice. And it does come on land, but that sea ice is really important to polar bears. So putting these clues together, how do you think climate change might affect the availability of ice in the oceans up north? If it's really important that the polar bears are out on the ice caps, that's where they find the seals. What do you think would happen if the overall temperature on the planet's going up? What's going to happen to that ice? Anybody have any ideas? I see Jacob's got their hand up. What do you think, Jacob?
The ice is melting.
Yeah, and melting, right? And I see people saying that in the chat too, that it could melt if it gets too hot, and then they won't be able to get out on the ice, and then they won't have those spaces to build their shelters. I see also in the comments it said if it's too cold, the seals cannot get near the polar bears. So if it's too cold, it's also a problem if there's too much ice and it's too thick, then they can't get through. So it's kind of like you were saying earlier, it's really important that we have a consistent range of temperatures, because animals have adapted to live in those spaces. So you're right. These are some pictures, and you can see a map. This is kind of tricky because this is not how we usually see maps of the world, but it's a picture of looking down on Earth from above at the Arctic. And this is where polar bears live. And so some researchers and scientists have looked at where polar bear populations are increasing and where they're going down. And you can see the red ones are where they're declining. So some of the ones in Canada, there aren't as many polar bears. Some of them are stable, and a couple of them are increasing because the bears are moving to different places as the ice melts. And then some of them, they just don't know. They don't have the data. So if you're interested in polar bears, you might grow up and want to be a researcher that goes out and studies populations, because they still don't have a lot of information about how many polar bears there are. But what they're finding is without sea ice, a lot of polar bears are moving inland. And that's tricky because they're moving in places where people live, and people are a bit scared of polar bears in their communities. So it's dangerous because the people want to live in the same places as the polar bears. So they have to try and manage that, because normally the polar bears would be out on the ice shelves. Now they're coming more inland as the sea melts. So it's changing the way people interact with wildlife too. So it's not always a case of them increasing or decreasing, but maybe moving, like you said, to different places. And what does that mean? So things to think about when ice is melting too. I don't know if anyone knows this one. This is a mountain pine beetle. So we're talking really little, and insects too, right? We're thinking about how climate change might impact insects. So mountain pine beetles eat tissues from pine trees, but they really like the older trees, like usually more than 80 years old. They'll eat those kinds of trees because it's usually easier for them to get the older trees because they're not usually as healthy. So they can burrow under their bark, and then they'll extract water from the tissues that it eats and lay its eggs under the tree bark. So it really relies on these trees. They're really important to these pine beetles. And then in terms of space, they live in forests in Western North America, but it's cold winters that prevents them from spreading north. So it's cold winters that stop them from going much further. And while they're an important part of the ecosystem, they've also can be a real problem because they can kill tons of trees. So a lot of people think of them as a real pest because they can eat up a lot of trees and kill them off. So while they're important, we don't want them everywhere because they can cause problems too. So those cold winters are really important in helping prevent them from spreading too far. So thinking about that, how do you think, and again, this takes a bit of thinking, how do you think climate change might affect the spaces where a pine beetle can live? If the cold weather stops it, like if it's a stop sign saying, nope, you can't come any further, it's too cold for you. If it starts getting warmer, what do you think might happen to the places where a pine beetle can live? And I see some comments in the chat. If it's too hot, again, the forests might be really prone to forest fires. So that might be affecting pine beetles if the trees they live in are burnt through forest fires because of raising temperatures. Arkai says it might be a parasite and it will kill the old trees. Yeah, it might be able to get into new areas because as places warm up, that opens the door to say, oh, maybe you can live here and survive here. So yeah, you're hitting the nail right on the head. Again, you're really thinking critically because that's exactly it. Here's a picture of trees and you can see the red trees. Those are the ones that pine beetles have eaten. So you can tell they really are chowing down on this forest. And then next to it's a map and you can see the range. So the dark gray is the historic area where mountain pine beetles could live in BC, for example, so British Columbia. And then they started measuring as temperatures gotten a bit warmer, they've been able to move a bit further along. And so the light gray is starting to show where they've been detected. So they're moving out and finding new places to live because it's warm enough that they can do that. It's not as hard because the winters aren't as cold, so they're surviving. And while that's really good for the pine beetle, it's not so good for some of the forests. So it's really complicated because in some cases, climate change is really going to be good for some species, but it's going to be bad for others like the trees. And so there's lots of stories in the news about these beetles, about how they're threatening forests. And of course, we rely on forests for paper and all kinds of different products. How warm weather has these beetles coming in and it's impacting the price of paper and lumber. I even heard on the radio the other day that because actually this winter it's been a bit colder, it's been really significant because it's prevented a lot of the pine beetles from moving around. So they're really excited in a lot of the industries because they're not going to move quite as far. So you can see in the news that this really impacts people and people's jobs and what they're thinking about because it changes where these animals can live. So one more species I want to highlight because I wanted to highlight a mammal and a bird and an insect, and I want to highlight a fish because we don't always think about fish because we don't see them all the time. We don't live in the water. So Chinook salmon, they eat insects and crustaceans, which are like little animals that have exoskeletons or shells. But they don't eat on their long journey upstream to spawn. So they'll be born up in rivers and then they'll go to the ocean and then they'll spend about 2 years eating and getting bigger and growing. And then something in them says, oh, it's time to go back upstream and so I can lay my eggs. And it's a really long journey back upstream, like thousands of kilometers. So they need to be really strong and well fed. So they're a really interesting species because they travel a long way from freshwater rivers to the ocean, and then they go all the way back. So they need to eat a lot of food on their way. For water, they're in the water all the time. So they absorb it through their skin. And what's interesting about them, and someone earlier said this, is they can't survive in warmer waters. So they need a certain temperature or else they have a lot of problems. If it's too hot, then they won't survive. And someone in the chat pointed out, if it's too cold, the water can freeze, and that's a problem too. Absolutely. For shelter, they're really interesting. They'll dig a nest with their tail. They'll go back and forth, and in the gravel, they'll dig a little nest, and that's where they'll lay their eggs. And then in terms of space, we sort of talked about this. They migrate from cold water streams all the way to the ocean, and it's up to 4,800 kilometers that they travel. That's a long way to travel, especially when you're just a small fish. So again, I'm asking you to put your thinking caps on because this is a bit tricky, but how might climate change affect the temperature and availability of their water? They live in the water all the time, and I think some people already said in the chat, but what could happen to the water that they're in? And how might that impact their journey from the ocean up the rivers? Any thoughts on that or any ideas?
You know, Kaylee, while they're thinking about this one, I just had an anecdote that popped into my head because we have friends at Oceanwise in British Columbia, and I was just in a meeting with them the other day, and they said that the drought in British Columbia is having a huge impact on the Chinook this year. So another thing to think about, why might a drought be so bad for fish that need to use rivers? Because it's a
Absolutely.
big issue this year.
Yeah, great question. And I see Kai's in the chat said, if it's more than 20 degrees, the salmon, it might be like boiling in it, you know, it's hard for them to function. And that's absolutely right. And then just as you said, the water might dry up too. So if it gets too dry, is there going to be a river all the way back to where they started? Or are there going to be patches where the water is too low to get across? That could happen as well. So that's a really good observation. And that, you know, you start to think about how climate change can affect things along the way. They even said, because they go up these big rivers that start up in glaciers, as the water melts, sometimes it causes flash floods. And if there's too much water in the stream, there's too much flow, it's really hard for the salmon. It can really wash away the eggs or cause problems. So you start to realize that climate and weather and all of that really has an impact on food and water and shelter and space. And that's what they're finding is salmon, it's really hot. It's hard for them to survive in the warmer waters, or they're not making it back to their traditional grounds. So in the Yukon, some of the First Nations are saying, hey, there's no salmon here. And their communities relied on salmon for food and traditional, uses. And now the salmon aren't even making it all the way back. So you can see in this map, just one of the migration routes that some of the Chinook salmon take. They go all the way from Alaska up the Yukon River and down into the Yukon. That's a long way to go. And if at any point along the river, there's not enough water, or if there's too much water flowing, then they might not make it back. So it's a real challenge for some of these species if the climate's changing and impacting these things. So with that, we looked at some of the species and different types of animals and how climate change might impact them. But I want to say, what do you think could impact us? Because we're animals too. We live in these places just like all of these other species. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think climate change might impact humans. What do you think could happen that would impact us? Any thoughts on that one? Our food, I see in the chat, someone said that we might not have as much food, and that's really whether it's things that we are growing. Maybe if we're growing crops and plants, and if there's a drought, then maybe there won't be as many, and that's happened. Or if we get too much rain and everything floods, things might not grow. Or animals, if they're fish, we rely on fish and we want to eat salmon and the salmon aren't doing well, then we're in tough times too. So yeah, our food could be impacted. Any other thoughts on how we might be impacted by climate change? There's some really good ideas, some good thinking happening.
I think a lot of the ideas that they came up with for the animals could be for us too.
That's
right?
a good hint, Rebecca. You're right. Maybe think about, are we going to be impacted by the same kinds of things? Yeah. And so Zoe said the water is gone. We need water too, right? And so if some of our fresh water is evaporating because the climate's getting warmer, or maybe the rainfall patterns are changing, that's important for us too, because we need water. Yeah, so absolutely, we need food, we need water too, we need shelter, and we need space. And sometimes, you know, big storms can come in and they might cause problems. I know in Nova Scotia this year, they had a hurricane come through and the winds blew trees around and it impacted their housing. Or it can change our coastlines and people living on the ocean if the water levels are changing. It can be really tough. So it's a good reminder that just like wildlife, we also have the same impacts on, we need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need space. And these are all really important things, not just to birds and butterflies and mammals, but to humans too. So what can we do? Because we can do a lot. It sounds really sad and it sounds like there's a lot of challenges out there, but there's a lot that we can do. So the first thing I really encourage you to do is learn more about some of the local animals, local species. Do you even know what kind of animals live in your area? And then learn like which ones maybe are at risk of going endangered and why. It's really nice to think about what's happening in the places where we live. So the first thing I always think that's important is to just learn more, which is what you're doing today. And so that is so important. And then the second one, I don't know, has anybody heard of citizen science before? Raise your hand if you've ever heard about being a citizen scientist. I see Rebecca has, but I see some question. Yeah, some people maybe have, but it's basically being a citizen scientist. It's really fantastic because a lot of researchers can't be everywhere at once. And so they've created these platforms where you can help them do research as a citizen. So a person who goes out into their community. And so one of them is iNaturalist. They're studying animals and plants, where they are, or eBird. They're looking at where birds live. There's all kinds of projects where researchers are asking people like you to help them figure out where species are living and what's going on, because they just don't know enough about animals. So you can be a citizen scientist by going out and recording what you see in your neighborhood. What kind of plants are growing there? And what kind of animals do you see? So you can be a scientist and contribute to that research. Another big one we can do is we can protect and create habitat for wildlife. So what does that mean? What about bird houses? Maybe we can learn how to build a bird house for certain bird species that we know live in our area, or plant a school garden or a backyard garden with lots of flowers and things for pollinators, because we know that they need flowers as food, or water, create like little puddles and things. Or help protect habitat in our community and say, it's really important we have parks and areas by the river, because that's where wildlife are going to be. So we can do a lot to protect habitat and create habitat in our backyards by making bird feeders or nesting boxes and bat houses. Someone in the comment, I think that was Rebecca, said bat houses. Absolutely, bats need habitat too. So there's a lot we can do to help with that. And then we can connect with groups in our community. People are doing cool things all across the country. Maybe it's a group that's doing a shoreline cleanup, like in the picture, and your school can get out and help clean up these habitats for wildlife. Or maybe somebody's doing a planting project and they're going to plant tons of trees and you can get out and help. There's lots of really cool things happening in communities, and you can join in and make a big difference by helping with those projects. And the other thing we can do is we can talk to our families and friends and tell them what we know, because we don't know what we don't know. So you can tell your family and friends about some of the species in your area and some of the things you can do. And it's more impactful for them to hear it from you than to hear it from someone they don't know. I could go in and tell everybody what they should be doing, but it's so helpful when you tell your friends or you tell your family and they hear it from you. So you can educate people that you know. And then finally, has anybody heard of the word carbon footprint? That's a big word too, but if you've heard of a carbon footprint, let me know. Rebecca knows. A carbon footprint, that's looking at how much greenhouse gases we produce. So remember we talked about how when we drive our cars or we do different things, it can create pollution. So we can look at ways that we can reduce it. Can we take the bus sometimes instead of always driving our car, or ride our bikes, or walk if we can, if it's close enough? Can we reduce the amount of pollution and garbage by reusing things or recycling? Those are small things that you can do in your home and every day, but make a huge impact. If we all did that, it would be a huge game changer when it comes to wildlife and climate change. So these are just a few ideas. And if you have any ideas, I really encourage you to share them in the chat, or you can feel free to put up your hand if you have any ideas about things you could do. But this is a great place to start because they have a really big impact on wildlife and habitats in your own communities and backyards. So just some ideas to get you thinking. And with that, I just want to remind you that together we can really make a difference. It can feel like such a big problem that's well beyond anything we can do. But if everybody did a little something in their own communities or homes, together we would have a huge impact. So I just want to thank you all for joining me today and talking about climate change and learning a bit about wildlife. And I hope you'll feel inspired to go out and do some projects in your own communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was awesome. We do only have a few minutes left. We can stay for a couple extra minutes if we need to, but now's your chance. If you have any burning questions, now's your chance to ask them. So we have Kaylee for a few more minutes. So if you guys have any questions about any of the species that you learned about today, or any of those climate related questions, you can ask them now. While we're brainstorming some questions, I do have one more thing I wanted to show you all. We have kind of a fun quiz that you guys can do. So I know in school, we're not always allowed to have devices with us. So if you are as a class, you actually can do this as a class as well. Your teacher will just answer for everyone and let me know how many of you there are. But it's a cool little quiz where you can find out what sea creature you are. So we just quickly talked about the salmon. That's just one example of a species that lives in the ocean. But since I'm in Canada, we have tons of coastline. So all of these species are interconnected. They're all connected to the ocean. Yeah, if you've done an event before, you may have tried this. Try it again, Joseph. See if you get the same answer this time, right? Maybe some of your ideas have changed. You might get a new creature. You can learn about a new sea creature. So it's a quick quiz. It only takes a couple of minutes. So it'd be awesome while we're kind of thinking about some questions. You guys can go ahead and do that quiz. Maybe let us know in the chat what you get as an answer. Joseph said he was a dolphin. I know our friend Sarah at CGE, she was a shark. So we've got lots of cool, interesting sea creatures that could pop up on there while we're thinking about questions. And while I'm waiting to see if we have any pop in the chat, I do have one question for you, Kaylee. If you had to have, I know we talked a little bit about it on the last slide of things to do, but if you had to say one big thing that every student watching today could do to help these species, what would you say is the one best thing that they can do coming out of this?
Yeah, such a good question. Because like I said, there's so many different things that you can do. And I think everybody's different in what they're able to do. But I think the best thing you can do is just look at what's in your own home and what you're doing and reducing your carbon footprint. So it's great to think about big things that are happening in Canada or species in your province, but sometimes it's best to start at home. So looking at small ways that you can reduce that carbon footprint is really impactful. And then if you feel like, okay, now I've got some momentum, then you can build to doing things in your school or doing things in your community or thinking about things in across the country. But I'd really encourage you to just start at home and think about, how can I reduce maybe the amount of power I'm using? Can I turn some lights off? Or can I, find ways, like I said, to walk more? That's really important. So starting at home, and then as you build momentum, then thinking about your community, and then thinking maybe about Canada broadly.
Really? Yeah. Joseph, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Or you put it back down? I don't know if we answered it. Oh, you got a new answer. See, you're a sea turtle now. Sometimes they change a little bit depending on what event you go to. Awesome. Dolphin and a sea turtle. Those are two great creatures. Okay, well, we're already 1 minute over, so if we don't have any more questions in the chat. Oh, Nicole and Mark got theirs through, say that they're coral. That's a great one. Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us. Especially thank you very much to Kaylee and CWF. Thank you very much for making this possible. I always learn so much in these events, and so I know for sure our students do. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. And thank you to all of our schools that are here and those of us joining us on YouTube. Thank you to all of my corals and sea turtles and kelp. Very nice to see everybody today. And yeah, we hope to see you guys again soon. So thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
That was
Thank